It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm here to talk about the topic of coevolution.
Maybe click back on the slide.
Okay,
There we go.
so definition of coevolution is evolution involving successive changes in two or more ecologically interdependent species. For example, of a plant and its pollinators that affect the way they interact. There's other types of coevolution besides just plants and pollinators. Some examples are plants and herbivores, pathogens and hosts, and parasitoids and their hosts. In 1964, Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven put out a big paper where they looked at all the different families of butterflies in the world and what were their host plants. You know, they gathered a lot of different information and made a bunch of generalizations and found patterns about how the plants chemically defended themselves and how different larvae of caterpillars co-evolved to be able to handle those toxins and kind of use them to their advantage. And so what they wrote in that paper was one approach that we would like to call coevolution is the examination of patterns of interactions between two major groups of organisms with a close and evident ecological relationship, such as plants and herbivores. Some of my colleagues, Nathan Rank and Carrie Winninger, wrote a literature review about comparing interactions between plants and their enemies, comparing herbivorous insects and pathogens. If you're interested, papers there, but they do a really thorough literature review looking at the different types of gene for gene evolution and escape and radiate evolution and how these different concepts show up in different papers. Virginia had the idea that I could create a bibliography to share. And I think maybe I'll create a sign-up sheet at the end because it's a lot of links. And so I didn't think printing it out would be that useful. But if people who are interested want, I can send it out after of all these different papers.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think you guys know those two people. They both work at Sonoma State. I think Carrie was involved.
She's on
really
the board.
Oh, she's on the
The
board.
board
Yeah.
secretary, was on the education committee, and of course now she's director of the Center for
Yeah.
Biological Research.
Yeah, so I thought I'd mention it because even though it's not about plants and pollinators, it is about evolution and you know them, so they wrote a paper about it. So going back to Darwin's time in 1862, Darwin, was sent this orchid that was from Madagascar that had a 12-inch spur. It had a really long part of it coming down, and there's nectar right at the bottom. And he wrote to a friend, "Good heavens, what insect can suck it? Like, it's got to be so long." So he hypothesized that there must be an insect out there with a proboscis long enough to reach the end of the spur. And after he died, what they call the giant hawk moth was discovered at Madagascar in 1892. It was just named as Xanthopan morgani. It belongs to the hawk moth family, or sphinx moth, sphingidae. And its proboscis ranges from 9 to 13 inches. It's really long. Yeah. And a group from the California Academy of Sciences went into Madagascar in the 90s and they collected one. And so they have one there that's on display. There's this really interesting YouTube video by PBS called "How Pollination Got Going Twice" that Nathan Rank told me about. And in the video, they describe that actually, and they look in the fossil record, lacewing relatives were found about 165 million years ago with pollen on them that was gymnosperm pollen. So nowadays we think of gymnosperms as being really wind and water pollinated. And they have these fossils of these lacewing relatives that have the pollen on their mouths. And then about 140 million years ago, they found beetles with pollen on them. And flowering plants arose about 120 million years ago. And they think beetles were kind of the transition of the animal facilitated pollination. And they were some of the earliest pollinators of the flowering plants, the angiosperms. So one of the classic examples they talk about them, magnolia. flower, how it's really big and wide and it like is a big landing platform. So beetles don't have the best eyesight. They're a little bit clumsy flyers, but they can land in the middle and they can, munch all the anthers in the pollen and fly from flower to flower, transferring pollen. And this chart sort of shows the radiation of the different angiosperm pollinators, the Coleoptera, which are beetles, some Neuroptera, the lacewings, and Meadowoptera through these ages of time. And then, yeah, when land plants were diversifying, so were winged insects. And the lineage that led to bees appears about in the Mesozoic period, which is the age of the dinosaurs. And when flowering plants appeared, a lot of bees started appearing too. So, something I asked some people, like, what do you consider like really great examples of people who study coevolution of plants and pollinators? And someone mentioned Vern and Karen Grant did a lot of work on this. So I looked it up, and they published this monograph called Flower Pollination in the Phlox Family. I found it at the library. It's really great. They worked at the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden and studied all about all the things in the phlox family, the Pollinators, and they go through all the different ones and what pollinates them. And they came to conclusion that it seems like within this group, bee pollination was the basal, like the most generalized state. And as they diversified, they got certain ones that had a longer corolla, got more specialized to long-tongued fly pollination, hummingbird pollination, butterfly, beetle, and self-pollination too. And some even to noctuid moths or hawk moth pollination. So it's pretty interesting that they started looking into the shapes of the flowers and who pollinates them and how did this all develop. They also wrote a book called Hummingbirds and Their Flowers that came out in 1968, and they talk about the different types of hummingbirds and the types of habitats they visit and the plants, and they noticed that even within the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, which has plant communities from all different areas of California recreated, that the hummingbirds from those different parts would on the garden like segregate themselves according to their plant communities, which is kind of cool. And they talk about this idea of reciprocal evolution. So how nectar feeding started to become more of a lifestyle for these birds, and as the flowers started offering more tubular shaped flowers with more nectar. Bees, they do drink nectar, but they go for pollen as like their nutrient-rich protein source. A lot of the shape of the hummingbird flowers tends to be tubular with like anthers hanging out. So as their head is going in the flower, they get the pollen on them, and then as they go fly around from place to place, bring it all around. There's an interesting study that was done called bee versus hummingbird flowers, where Shamsi and Bradshaw looked at two different types of monkey flowers that grow around the Yosemite area. They have the Mimulus cardinalis, that's the red one, and Mimulus lewisii. And one is a hummingbird flower, one is a bee flower. In nature, they noticed this broad open one is the one visited by bees. The tubular one was one visited by hummingbirds. In nature, about 95% of the time, bees came to A, and about 96% of the time, hummingbirds went to Z, and they created a hybrid of the two, and it made this shape of the flower, and then they put it out and watched what insect or what animals came to it, and it became about 50-50. And then they made hybrid, a second cross of the hybrid F2 generation that resulted in a bunch of different variations between the two flower shapes. And they had, anywhere ranging from 70 to 30% bee versus hummingbird. So it's kind of interesting that they could demonstrate like there's like a hummingbird shape and there's a bee shape of what the different animals prefer in terms of visiting for flowers. Another famous mutualism of a pollinator and a plant that live closely together are yuccas and yucca moths. So the yucca moth lays eggs, but it can't lay too many because the yucca needs to survive. It lays eggs within the flower ovary, and the larvae feed on that. And then as the plant comes into bloom in the springtime, the moths emerge and they mate, and then the females go to find new flowers to pollinate. And in that, or not to pollinate, they do pollinate them, but they're looking to go lay eggs for their next generation. And they have like specialized little antenna or appendages at the end where they can gather pollen. And then in the process of that, they scoop pollen and they disperse it as they're laying their eggs. I remember learning about this when I was like 9 years old at a nature center. I grew up in Southern California, where they were talking a lot about chaparral communities, and there's the yucca moth and the yucca, and I was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. That's what a mutualism is. Like, these two plants really benefit from each other. The yucca benefits by pollination, and the moth benefits, it has a place to live and eat and raise its young. And this also applies to Joshua trees too. Yeah, like all the different yuccas. And there is a professor at Cal State Northridge named Jeremy Yoder, and he was curious about like, what is like evolutionary requirements, how this happened, like how many traits were there before they became like such a tight pair. And so he was looking into, like, he like did a bunch of analysis of the phylogenies and the traits and everything. And he found that this group of moths had kind of already adapted to living in dry environments, living with woody plants and laying eggs in the ovary. And he found that the traits that made it a mutualism was the feathery appendages for pollen and the behaviors of scooping the pollen and laying the eggs. So I thought that was really interesting. He's like, okay, what actually makes it a yucca moth? And he like looked into it, and he did a lot of genetics to do it. So. And he's, it's a native California plant, person studying in California. Another really interesting ecological interaction that I learned about recently is that native orchid, Epipactis, is pollinated by syrphid flies. So syrphid flies eat pollen and nectar as adults, but as larvae, they're predators. They eat aphids and other insects. And this orchid apparently gives off the scent of honeydew. Honeydew are the secretions that aphids make when they're drinking. They drink plant juices, and like the juice comes out of them. And so a lot of ants will like to drink it and stuff. So it gives off the scent of honeydew. And so syrphid flies who are they usually lay their eggs on clusters of aphids so that the larvae will have something to eat when they hatch. They're attracted to that scent, and so they go to the orchid and pollinate it. So I thought that was really trippy.
So they trick the flies? Is that what they're doing?
They're being like, hey, come check out this scent. This really, somehow they're like evolved this attractive scent that's like the right cue that the fly is looking for. And it drops off the pollinia on its back. It's going to drink the nectar or smell the honeydew or whatever, and it's getting the little packet of pollen on its back, and as it goes from flower to flower. Orchids are known for, they have their pollen like more in a packet, and so they need the animal pollination or animal dispersal to help. And it's like kind of specific about where the pollen lands on the insects to be able to get carried to the next orchid. So they have some pretty cool shapes and mechanisms. And I'm going to segue a little bit into my topic that I covered on my master's research, which is about bees that are associated with vernal pool flowers. So this is an interesting mutualism because there are bees that specifically go to flowers that grow in vernal pools. They only come out for 6 to 8 weeks as adults of the year when their flower is in bloom. And Robin Thorpe from UC Davis has studied vernal pool pollinators at Jackson Prairie and other places around California since the 1960s. And one of his PhD students, Joan Leong, she studied the vernal pool pollinators of Blennosperma in the Central Valley, and she also did a side project in Santa Rosa. And I met her at a conference And she's like, I want to come back and visit my site. You want to come out with me? So we got to go. We got to go back to the place where she visited. And so they found that for the insects visiting the vernal pool flowers, they're in the family Andrenidae, also known as mining bees. Mining bees are a large family that has a lot of species, and most of them, they're called mining bees because they nest in the ground. The females will excavate little tunnels and create nests. And many of them are very picky about the type of pollen they collect to provision their nest. So a word for that is oligolectic, means feeding from a few types of flowers. So usually within the same genus, or like collecting pollen from a single genus or species. Most of these andronid bees are solitary. That means each female is making her own nest and provisioning her own nest versus like a honeybee hive where the workers are going out and the female's laying the egg. I mean, the queen is laying the eggs. Yeah, one of the key characters, if you're looking at the body of an insect to see what it is, the andrenids have two subantennal sutures going between the antenna and the nose. They have those things. They also have like 3 submarginal cells on their wings instead of 2 in the sweat bees, which is like you have to look under a microscope to count the wings, the wing venation. Yeah, so solitary bee life cycle. I'll start in the springtime. The adult is out collecting pollen. Female, she's collecting pollen. She excavates a little nest and collects pollen and nectar. Makes a little provision, nest provision, a pollen ball. We'll lay a little egg on top of it, and then seal off that little chamber, and then go back again and again, and maybe do 15 to 20 eggs in the course of her life. And the egg will hatch out into a larva. The larva eats their food provision and then will overwinter as a pupa and then come out in springtime. Somehow, some cue, they can tell, okay, it's time to come out. Then they'll come out as an adult again. So a lot of these have 1 generation per year. And a lot of that life cycle is underground.
They seal their nest holes with like a mud mixture or anything?
Some of them do, but some of them you can like see the little like excavated mounds of dirt with a hole.
Okay.
So that's one way to like look for them is to, and I never found, like looking around Santa Rosa, I never really found any. But I got the advice, like if you do find them and you want to know like what insect is using it, you can put like a clear cup over it. And then if something is in it, it'll be coming out, trying to get out, or if it's out foraging, then it'll be like circling the cup, trying to get in. So that's like a non-invasive way. Then, take off the cup when you're done, but don't leave it there. But that's just like a non-invasive way to try to observe who might be using this little hole in the ground. So, through their research, Thorpe and Leon found that there was the geographic distribution on this map. The black line is the geographic distribution of the Blennosperma plants throughout California, and then the dots are where they found the specialist bee within their distribution. This is the distribution of the Limnanthes meadowfoam, all the different species of meadowfoams, and then the two different bees that are associated with meadowfoam, Andrena limnanthes. Well, now it's called Andrena pulveria and Panagynous occidentalis. So there are quite a few more have been found of that type versus Blennosperma. And for Andrena sabinista, which uses Lasthenia as its host plants, they're also quite more widespread. There's also a lot more Lasthenias in this state, spread out. And they have found them quite widespread throughout the thing. And then for Downingia, which is called calico flower, which is a small little flower. It has a really small little bee called Panagynous atriceps, and there were found them a couple places, and these are the different types of where Downingia is found. Some of them have short anthers, long anthers, and sulfurs, but I found some when I brought them to Robin. He's like, "Oh, you helped me put more dots on my map." So that was after he made this map. But some of these were found in San Rosa area too. Other flower visitors that like to visit these vernal pool flowers are like a golden dung fly. There tends to be a lot of cows grazing around, and their dung is there, and so that's where they lay their eggs and have their larvae. But in the meantime, they're going around getting snacks and perching on flowers and stuff. So I've seen golden dung flies on them a lot. Surface flies and bombolid flies were a lot of their visitors. Also, small little beetles tend to visit them. Minor beetles and carpet beetles tend to be visitors. So it's, there are these closely ecologically linked species that collect the specialist pollen collectors and the flowers. And then there's all these other ones that are also part of the community. And so I'm going to segue to my specific research project, which was looking at these 3 different endangered plants and who their pollinators are in the Santa Rosa Plain area. This was my research that I did field work for in 2009 to 2012. So I started working with Dr. Christina Sloop, who used to be a conservation science manager at the Laguna Foundation. She was a plant geneticist, and she was really interested in these endangered plants. And if there was genetic structure within the plants, if there were certain populations that might be for conservation priority. So she was collecting plant tissue and seeing what was going on within the population. And she's like, you know what, we should look at, the seed production and also pollinators, because that's like what moves genes too, is, insects moving around. So we did a bunch of different stuff where we had some like open seed versus that little like shower cap to exclude pollinators, so we could count how many seeds were produced without pollinators versus with. And they can, to an extent, they do produce some seed like selfing, but they do more when they're open pollinated. But pollinator observation and sampling was my part of the project. So we did this bigger project with all these things, and I did the pollinator animation, pollinator observation. So part of our methods were that I observed within a half-meter quadrats for 10-minute intervals, sort of in the peak time of insect activity between 9:30 and 3:30, and I had a minimum of 10 observations per study site. And I noticed like the insects would kind of go away if the wind was above 6 miles per hour. So I like measured the wind speed and excluded things it was too windy. And then another thing I was looking at in my study was if there were pollinators visiting flowers in constructed vernal pools versus naturally occurring vernal pools, because that was a concern. Like, hey, they're creating these vernal pools over here and just moving seeds there and saying, okay, good luck, survive. And so I want to know, well, are the pollinators finding those new ones, and are they, getting enough, or are those populations getting enough of what they need to be sustainable long-term, including pollination? So I had natural versus constructed pools in my study. And through the observation, I noticed 4 different insect types that were visiting them: the solitary bee and the honeybee. Solitary bees are about 2/3 the size of the honeybee. It's hard to tell the species when they're buzzing around, so I just had more broader categories. And syrphid flies and bombolid flies were the big types that I saw in the observational study. And so when I looked at Blennosperma bakeri, Sonoma Sunshine, I found that solitary bees were the greatest number of pollinators, the syrphid flies second, and that there was a significant difference between natural versus constructed sites. For meadowfoam, the insect category was significant. There was significantly more solitary bees than any other type of insects that were visiting them. And it wasn't significant between natural versus constructed sites. And then also day was significant. So like in the season, it started off low and it got higher and higher. And so day was a factor that ended up being significant. And for Burke's Goldfields, natural versus constructed was kind of a marginally significant, but if you notice, there's another column here, which is bombolid flies. So the bombolid flies were actually the most frequent visitor of these flowers, more than bees and syrphid flies. So yeah, there was something that was interesting. Type of site was marginally significant, but insect category and type of site had a significant interaction. So solitary bees and syrphid flies were higher in constructed sites, and bumbleweed flies were higher in natural sites, which is kind of interesting. What's going on there? And then because, like I said, the observations were just broader categories, I did do some specimen collections with permits to be able to identify insects under a microscope and get more of that detail. So I netted insects directly off of patches of each of the plants for 30 minutes at each study site during the peak hours. And I also placed an array of yellow, white, and blue bowls with soapy water called pan traps out for 24 hours. And from that, I collected a lot of individuals. From net collections, I collected. I'm just going to focus on bees because there was a lot of different insects. But for bees, I found bees from 4 different families, 8 genera, and 31 species were collected directly off of these 3 endangered flowers. And for pan traps are a little bit more general because they collect whatever's in the area, not necessarily your focal plant. I found 62 different species of bees from our local Santa Rosa area. Yeah. And so looking at that, I found that the solitary bee category consisted of those oligolectic bee species that Robin and Joan had described. Plus there were some other solitary bees, Andrena angusti tarsata, Andrena pensilius, Lasioglossum titusii, and Halictus tripartitus, which are kind of, I call them oligolectic lookalikes. So, and those were more abundant in the Blennosperma group. And then insect category was the only significant factor. It wasn't really significant site type or anything like that. So overall, for Blennosperma bakeri, we found that the visitation was lower in constructed pools, but started off high in natural pools and took longer. And then they had the higher proportion of the lookalikes compared to the oligolectic species. So in a way, you could say their pollinator community is a little more resilient because there's several different species visiting this plant versus just one. You know, if they lost that one species, there would be other ones that are still visiting it and pollinating it. Oh, this formatting is weird. But for meadowfoam, there was a huge number of the oligolectic bee, like 1,200 individuals, especially the pan traps were like very effective at catching them. And I, was thinking like, well, how could this be? Well, there's also we have Sebastopol meadowfoam, which is our rare and endangered vernal pool plant, but there's also common meadowfoam, which is a grassland wildflower that's really widespread. This map with California with all the blue dots are some of the documented occurrences of common meadowfoam. And one of the ways you can tell the difference is by the leaf shape. The Sebastopol meadowfoam leaves kind of look like Slurpee spoons. They have this sort of round and coming out thing. And then the common meadowfoam leaves are dissected. They're more frilly and fern-like. And so I would think, if the bee is a specialist on meadowfoam pollen, and there's a lot of meadowfoam, there's Sebastopol meadowfoam, common meadowfoam, there's plenty of food to go around, so there's higher populations in general of them. And then for the bumbleweed flies, bumbleweed flies are known as a pollinator with a bad reputation because they have this fuzzy body, they have a proboscis to, go deep into a flower, drink nectar. However, they're nest parasites of ground nesting bees, so they will fly around and find entrances to ground nesting bees and flick their eggs in there, and their larvae will hatch out and eat the ground nesting bees. And they often can also do like wasps, beetles and other things. And so we're not sure, are they parasitizing local bees? But, knowing that there's a big population of them, there must be a robust population of whatever they're parasitizing to support their numbers. So kind of an intriguing result, like, what's going on there? Yeah, and I want to acknowledge I had so much help from Robin Thorpe with identifying all these bees to species. Christina Sloop was the originator of the project. and helped me, like, when she worked at the Laguna Foundation, she had relationships with all these private landowners. So they're just like, yeah, come to my backyard. Like, yeah, here's the gate code. Here's you can go there, you know. And we also worked with the CDFW to go onto the preserves and the mitigation banks and stuff like that. There was more red tape. But she helped make this project happen. You know, she wrote the grant for it, hired me. But like just, you know, all the groundwork that she did helped make it possible for me to be able to visit all these sites. Nathan, he was young in that picture. But he is my thesis advisor and helped me with all my statistics and writing and everything, even though his main thing is studying beetles in the Eastern Sierra and how they adapt to temperature and all their parasites and predators and their endosymbionts and everything. He studies all of that. But he was like, yeah, I'm an entomologist. You can be my advisor. I mean, you can be my student, so I'll help you with your project. And then my friends Una and Alina, they work at a nonprofit called Conservation Works that does a lot of planting of pollinator gardens. And I became friends with them like a bit ago, and they've gotten me more into like educating people about how to plant pollinator gardens and more, not just about vernal pool pollinators, but like larger vernal pools. Larger bees and flowers and everything like that. So, yeah. Does anyone have questions about what I've talked about so far?
I've got one or two from the Zoom.
Okay.
Two to be specific.
Okay.
And if you wouldn't mind repeating the questions that are said, so that people on the Zoom can hear that.
Okay.
But the first one is in terms of the Epipactis. They asked specifically about the species Epipactis hellebore. And if they use the same scent trick, do you know if it's across the genus or?
You know, so the question was about specifically about Epipactis and with the syrphid fly pollinator, and they're asking specifically if Epipactis hellebore uses that same scent trick. And I honestly don't know the details about the specific species. I need to look that up.
The second question I had on here was, Gavin is wondering what he can do in his own yard to encourage this pollinator activity.
So someone was asking what they can do in their own yard to encourage pollinator activity. So one thing you can do is plant native plants that have bloom times at different times of the year. So early bloomers, late bloomers, middle bloomers, and you know, sort of providing those floral resources will create conditions for pollinators that come out and bees that come out at different times of the year to be able to have something to eat. Another suggestion is to leave some patches of open dirt. Don't have weed cloth or heavy mulch on all of your yard. Have some areas of open dirt for ground nesting insects to be able to use. You know, there's obvious things like avoiding pesticides and try not to use light bug zappers during the summer. You know, there's citronella candles instead. You know, if you need to work, if you're worried about mosquitoes. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions from the audience?
When you did your research, how old were the constructed wetlands?
So the question is, when I did my research, how old were the constructed wetlands? A lot of them were the same age. A lot of them were about 7 years old. And one of them was 25 years old. So that one was kind of an outlier because of its age, but it also had natural pools on site. It was like a hybrid of natural pools and constructed pools on the same site. So yeah, the age, that's more of a question that I wanted to look into further, but just because of the spread, it was hard to really answer. Do they do better with age or worse with age or something like that? Yes?
Well, I wanted to point out that Blennosperma bakeri is named after Milo Baker.
I wanted to point out that Blennosperma bakeri is named after Milo Baker, who is the namesake of this chapter. Yes?
So I took field botany in the spring, and we learned that there's bees, I think that they steal the pollen or they get the nectar without taking the pollen. I guess that's it.
Yes.
They're nectar thieves. And I thought that was fascinating, and I wondered if you had any experience with that.
Yes. Okay, so the question was, she took a class this spring where she learned about bees that are nectar robbers that steal the nectar without doing pollination, and what was my experience or knowledge of that. And yes, in a lot of the tube-shaped flowers, the hummingbird flowers, for example, California fuchsia, it's really long and it's like a hassle for a little bee to like climb in there to get deep in there. And so carpenter bees, for example, know how to bite the outside of the bottom of the tube. They'll make a little hole and then they'll drink the nectar from the outside without passing by the anther or the stigma and pollinating it. So that's called nectar robbing. And Robin pointed it out to me, and I've noticed that honeybees will come after and they'll use those same little holes. They don't bite the holes themselves. The carpenter bees bite the holes, but then other insects will come to the leftovers where the holes are and like use that as their little well. It's actually, and there's a picture in this book about it. It shows them doing it. I was looking, I was like, hey, do that. Here, I'll show the audience. But yeah, you guys are looking. Yes.
Do they, years ago, when I was in training as a steward up at Pepperwood,
Mhm.
we were out in a meadow near the old red barn, and it was kind of an overcast day.
Mhm.
And somebody pointed out a bee of some sort making a hole in a closed poppy. Would that be the same kind of bee?
I'm not sure. So Virginia was saying one time she was at Pepperwood in a meadow on a cooler day, and they saw a bee making a hole or a home in an enclosed poppy.
They
A
were
hole.
after something.
Okay. So yeah, they could have been biting in there. You know, I'm not sure exactly what that could be, but a lot of male bees actually, because they're not making their net, they're not making a nest. They're living to mate and eat and whatever. They will sleep on flowers at nighttime. And so sometimes you come out on a foggy morning and there's bees like sleeping in the flowers. Usually those are males. Yeah, because the females go back to their nest. Yeah.
What was the book that you showed us that has got all that in there?
The book that I was showing is Hummingbirds and Their Flowers by Karen and Vern Grant. This is the one from 1968 that I was talking about. Yes.
I just add, I'm the book insert person, and I brought extra copies of Garden Allies, which is about some of what you talking about.
Right. So the person who's in charge of merch has extra copies of Garden Allies here, who my wonderful friend and colleague Frederica Lavoie wrote. And it's all about the insects and other animals that keep your garden healthy and thriving. It's a really good book. Yes.
Question, sort of general question about life cycle.
Mhm.
If bees, if it's certain, they to be a certain annual life cycle, once, sort of in the fall, when our Mediterranean climate plants are sort of tailing down, are you seeing fewer and fewer bees at that time of year during fall? Are they going into hibernation, or what happens to, during those fall and winter time? Is there anything flying?
That's a great question. Okay, so the question was about with the annual life cycle, what happens to bees in the fall, later fall, going into winter? Do you see less bee activity? Yes, I definitely see less bee activity. Exceptions are honeybees, which are, perennial and going around. Another exception is bumblebees. So they have queens for the next year, and males come out in late summer. And then mate, and then queens will forage and they overwinter underground. And then they come out in early spring, just the queens, and then they will start their own nests. And so the bigger bumblebees tend to be out like in September or October. You might see them on coyote bush or like other late blooming plants. But yeah, as the flowers start to fade, things that have an annual life cycle, like the eggs or the larvae are waiting underground till the next year, or just, the adults are dying off as the season ends. Mhm.
Did you see any correlation between seed set and the density of the pollinators?
So the question is, did I see a correlation between seed set and the density of the pollinators? I don't know if we did that direct analysis. That would be a good thing to look into. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think the data does exist. I have to ask other people on the project for it, but yeah. That's a great question. Uh-huh.
No, we had a question about the other book that you showed, the Flocks.
Yes.
Yeah, would you mind showing it? And
Oh, sure.
and who wrote it?
Yeah, so this is also by Karen and Vern Grant. It's called Phlox, Flower Pollination in the Phlox Family. Ooh, that's a lot of neat little line drawings. Very retro book, like a little denim cover with silver embossed. Yeah. It has the library thing of all the times it was checked out. Seriously.
I got
Another
question from the Zoom, yeah.
Okay.
So how does fire impact overwintering bees, and how far below the surface do they overwinter?
That's an amazing question. I am not really sure about that. I know some of them, they're at a depth of like 12 to 18 inches. I don't really know any facts about how it affects their survival. Obviously, some of them survive because fire is part of California's ecology, but I don't know specific details on that.
I would imagine it has to do with the intensity of fire versus.
Yeah. Yeah, someone gave a comment that she imagined it would have to do with the intensity of the fire. How much it affects the ground nesting bees. Any other questions?
I guess I have more of an observation that is a little thought provoking in my head, so I thought maybe just share it with the group. So with some of the cultivated varieties, like the one that's coming to mind is Edward's Choice Epilobium. I've noticed that there's a lot more like nectar robbing on it and less visitation by hummingbirds, and that might be just because it's more prostrate and it's been selected to be low growing versus more of a wild type that has the longer stems, which I see visited by hummingbirds more. And it just made me think about more of those cultivated or selected varieties and how that influences, you know, those coevolutionary relationships between bees and hummingbirds and where it goes beyond just the shape of the flower. And I wonder if other people have noticed that or can think of that, but just when you're talking about it, kind of something that, yeah.
That's the point of these lectures, to stimulate.
Because I never made that connection, but I was like, yeah, when you look at Everett's Choice, there's often those little holes and nectar robbing on it, and I don't think I see hummingbirds very often on that one.
Interesting.
But I don't know, other people know, that's my observation.
All right, so Jazzy was sharing with the group that she's noticed for certain like varietals of California fuchsia epilobium, there's one that's more prostrate. She sees more nectar robbing, and she's not sure she's seen very many hummingbirds versus varieties that are more upright. And she's wondering how varietals that we use in landscaping might affect the pollinator attractiveness or relationships versus just the straight up native version. Could be like
Sorry,
open.
so nicely, better than I can get now.
Just open discussion question. Oh, yes.
So I just looked up, I just Googled ground nesting bees, and there's an article by Kane and Knapp. I'm trying to, in 2011, it looks like. Anyway, they said that fire can actually help the ground nesting bees because it creates more open areas as long as the intensity isn't that great. It affects more of the bees that are in twigs and obviously.
Oh, yeah,
those
cavity
types of bees.
nesters.
Yeah, cavity
Okay.
nester.
All right, so somebody in our audience just looked up the question of how does fire affect ground nesting bees? And at low intensity fires, it can actually help them because it burns off the thatch and creates more areas of open ground. Species of bees that are more affected by fires are ones that nest in hollow stems or in other vegetative cavity that's above the ground.
One aspect of that after a fire, there's often a huge bloom of
That's the other thing they said.
Yeah.
The floral resources, they said also increase.
Yeah, so David brought up that after a fire, there's a huge bloom of the fire following wildflowers, and that creates a huge boom of floral resources available for pollinators. So that could, also help boost ground nesting bees that survive.
And I imagine when indigenous peoples were interfering with
Mhm.
colonization with burning on a regular basis and there tended to be low intensity fires, there must have been a lot more bees, insects.
Yeah.
And what for the flowers?
Yeah, Virginia was saying she imagines that before, I guess, Western civilization, when indigenous peoples were managing the lands the way that they did, there must have been a lot more pollinators. And actually, John Muir wrote a book called The Bee Meadows of California
Right, I
that
remember.
talks about the just abundance of bees and wildflowers that were here before all the invasive plants and agriculture and everything else.